I've given this talk before, actually, and I think there are a lot of students here. And so you may have heard a version of this in some form or another. Unfortunately, one of the reasons we wanted to kind of give this talk also to the Department of Psychiatry was we just had a training, actually, for our asylum medicine clinic that is co-sponsored through Physicians for Human Rights. We actually had our first training in Brooklyn, I think, ever. And that was actually last weekend, previous weekend, sorry. And so the timing of this is a little bit off because we initially were hoping we could do this before in order to sort of spread the word. But in some ways we lucked out perhaps because we ended up getting way too many people. I think we had over 190 students and clinicians register for the training, which is, usually these trainings when they happen, it's maybe 20 people. So perhaps that was maybe a little bit of a blessing in disguise. But that said, I just wanted to first and foremost say thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I've had a lot of interactions with residents, interns from the Department of Psychiatry, and I have to say it's always been a pleasure to work with them. I find them to be some of the stronger residents that I work together with. And maybe I should get an honorable faculty appointment to the Department of Psychiatry, because. But it's always a pleasure to work with them because they work very hard. Their medicine is strong, and more importantly, I think maybe this part of going into psychiatry, like most of the interns that I've observed are just incredibly grounded and very empathic. And I think it will also tie into a little bit of the work that we do here. I've worked with Sam, and Sam has been our champion. He's right over there, in trying to sort of spread the word. Because the truth is, we really have a dire need for psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, people who are specialized in mental health, to do these psychological evaluations. I'm going to segue into this in the later half of this talk, but part of this is also to sort of emphasize the fact that we don't have enough people who are specialized and who can do really good psychological evaluations. And we have a lot of asylum seekers in New York City and in the United States. And by far the biggest need for medical affidavits, more so than medical evaluations, is psychological evaluations. And there's a huge line of people who are waiting for the opportunity to get that evaluation. And it makes a huge difference in the outcome. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So I'm going to take you guys on a little bit of a trip outside of New York City and talk a little bit about the work that I'm currently doing that involves refugees as well. And I will start with this slide. This here is, this is the African continent, which you see right now. Where that little pointer is pointing to a small town in the southwestern corner of Uganda. There's a small town there called Kastor, and believe it or not, Downstate actually has a formal partnership with a district hospital in Kastor town. It's a government hospital, and I've been working there as faculty for, I guess, almost 7 years now. It's 2020, so ever since 2013. And there is a small partnership between that hospital, this hospital as well, and predominantly with Albert Einstein, where I used to work before moving here. And they have this agreement where students, residents, and attendings staff the medical wards at that district hospital. And last year was our first clinical rotation. It's a downstate rotation that's offered to students. So if any of you students are interested, please talk to me afterwards. Where we take our students there for about 4 weeks, and we have them work very hard in taking care of patients. But before I go into that, notice next to Uganda is a huge country, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I'm sure you have heard of this country before, and I think it doesn't quite make the news that often. Right now, I think if you hear about things about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I'm going to just say DRC, I think it's mostly because of the Ebola crisis that's been ongoing, actually, particularly in the eastern provinces. The DRC is, we could have several lectures just on the history and the issues that are happening in the DRC, but in the interest of time, the DRC is a huge country. It's pretty much the same size as Western Europe, and it has been host to probably one of the longest humanitarian crises probably ever. 4 decades, essentially, of ongoing human rights abuses, particularly in the eastern Kivu region, which is the eastern provinces bordering Uganda and Rwanda and Burundi. Is this pointer? Is there a pointer here? Do you see that? Okay. So this region here is Kivu region. And really a lot of the history, dates back to the Rwandan genocide, actually. So this is since the mid-90s. It's been known as the Great African War. And during the last 4 decades, at some point or another, all of its neighboring countries have been involved in the conflict. And a lot of it is still along ethnic lines. Now, in addition to not having a very strong centralized government, the DRC is, because of its terrain and the geography and its vastness, has been host to some, at this point, the latest count is over 140 different independent militia groups. Some of them have been tied to governments outside, such as Rwanda, some of them even from Uganda. I feel like a few years ago, there was a big sort of awareness about the Lord's Resistance Army. I'm sure you've maybe heard of that, or maybe you've heard of Kony. That was another example of a militia group that was from the Uganda that had fled into basically the dense rainforest of the Congo. So in addition to, having all these military groups and paramilitary groups, there's been, as you would imagine, chronic displacement of communities, and also an incredible amount of human rights abuses, particularly violence against women. And this has been going on for decades, and it really doesn't make the news so much, particularly also because a lot of the, if there is going to be any attention on refugees and conflict-displaced folks, it's going to usually be around South Sudan. And I think we hear about that in the news quite a bit. And why do I say this? Well, it turns out that when we were working in the Kastor District Hospital, as it is the only sort of government hospital in that region, located maybe 10 kilometers from the border of the DRC, as well as 10 kilometers from the border of Rwanda, in this tiny corner right over here. So this is a little... this hospital happened to be the main referral hospital for a lot of the refugees. In Kastor, which is the town that the hospital is located in, there is a UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. There is something called a transit camp, which is a little different from a refugee camp, a resettlement camp, because it's where people first filter into when they cross the border, having, let's say, fled conflict. And transit camps, you don't hear about them so much because it's not where people are going to be there. They're not there for more than 2 weeks on average, 2 weeks to maybe a month. But it's the first sort of point of entry into a country. It's the first place they get some shelter, a little bit of medical attention. They get food, they get water. If there's a safe space for children, usually run by an organization like Save the Children. But they're sort of registered at that point, and they're processed in terms of their immigration, whether they're going to seek asylum, whether they're going to be just a temporary refugee. And then later on, if it doesn't seem like they're going to be able to repatriate safely, then they move on to a more permanent UNHCR refugee camp. And that's what when people think of refugee camp, that's more of a permanent refugee camp. But these transit centers exist all along the border, particularly where we are here in Kasoro. Further up here too, there's another entry point near Kasese. And then, of course, up here in South Sudan, where the conflict has been very intense over the last 10 years, there are a lot of transit camps here. So the reason we sort of started to get involved was mostly because the UNHCR transit camp, when they screen individuals, particularly if they have any sort of acute medical illness, they would then be referred to the hospital. And that is sort of our first contact with people who are conflict displaced. Just to sort of highlight, this is a little bit old, but there's a group here based out of NYU led by a man named Jason Stearns, who's an investigative journalist who lived in the DRC for a long time. But they have been doing a lot of research around the armed conflicts in North and South Kivu. And this was the last count this is from like 5 years ago, but there were an estimated 70 different armed militias, and it has almost doubled, and causing up to 1.6 million people being displaced. This, just to give people a little visual image, this is Kasoro Hospital right here. It's a beautiful place. It's very elevated, which is why they don't have malaria, actually. And there are these 3 huge volcanoes. That's the parking lot of the hospital. This is a picture of us being there just recently. These are our medical students who are now 4th years. 2 of our medical students are actually going into psychiatry. There's Brian and Amy. They're both going into psychiatry. These are our faculty from Downstate. This is Dr. Page, and this is the back of Dr. Yeager. She's an ID doctor here. And so we were there for 4 weeks. And the medical ward, or medical surgical ward, is where we take care of patients who are admitted. There's no psychiatric ward. And so at any given point, if there are people who need to be hospitalized for any psychiatric illness, acute psychiatric illness, they usually just get admitted to the medical ward. And even in the 4 weeks that we were there last June, we would have at least maybe 5% of our patients coming in because they had some form of an acute psychiatric illness. Usually, schizophrenia was actually one of the biggest things that we had seen that required an admission. This is just, I think, straight out of the UNHCR website. But this is just, this is the border of Uganda and the DRC. And this just kind of details some of the hot zones of movement. These areas that are marked in red are known as the active corridors. And this is where, right here is where Kasoro is, which is right by this area of entry. And here is Nyakabande Transit Center, which is that UNHCR transit center that I was talking about. And what does a transit center look like? This is a picture from May of 2019, so a month before we were there. One of the things about 5 years ago, we reached out as a community, actually from Kasoro town. We reached out to the UNHCR camp, and we had a discussion with them because it seemed like the majority of our patients who were being referred from the transit center, so those who were acutely displaced, were being admitted initially what was thought for as for medical reasons, but overwhelmingly they were mostly psychiatric etiologies. So they manifested a lot of times with physical symptoms, but more often it was related to the acute trauma. So most of the folks who are here that you see, for example, these were people who had been just displaced. Most often the narrative was they were in their village and they had to pick up and run because they were being attacked. And then along the way, either they would see people getting murdered or people would get captured and they would watch their children getting abducted. A lot of young, especially boys, were being abducted at this time. And women were being subjected to rape. and exorbitant rates. And so this would happen, and these people would have this happen maybe days to maybe a couple weeks before. So this is really in that acute phase. And so by the time sometimes people would come into the hospital because they had an acute illness that was medical, but more often than not, it seemed it was more because of the severe psychological stress. So when we reached out to the hospital, from the hospital to the camp and said, listen, we feel like there's something that's not, there's a need that's perhaps not being met. And we basically partnered with the UNHCR as well as the Office of the Prime Minister, which runs the logistics of the camp. And we decided that we would start a psychosocial support center. And this was the first, I don't know if you see this tent, it's actually in the back right here. But that was our first psychosocial support center, where we then hired 2 social workers who were trained in sort of individual counseling and family counseling. This is from the Uganda Institute. And we had them placed there to sort of see, okay, what are the sort of the needs that need to be met? What are some of the things that people can need assistance with? And this isn't just specifically mental health. This was also much more broader in terms of psychosocial support. This is just a picture of the inside of one of the shelters where a lot of the conflict displaced folks stay. You can see it's very minimal. So this is just a description or a definition of what a UNHCR transit camp actually offers. So it's mostly short term. It's to offer shelter, water, and sanitation, and health services, and also services for children. And people are generally not there for more than 2 weeks, and if they require any longer stay, they're usually moved to a more permanent resettlement. So as I started talking a little bit about sort of the Psychosocial Support Center, the other thing we had started doing back in 2013 was we wanted to start interviewing any of the patients who were referred to the hospital to see if they had been subjected to any forms of human rights abuses. And so we conducted 40 different interviews, mostly on a convenience sample, so it's not really a random sample, of folks who were admitted to the hospital. And it turns out that a very high number of people had witnessed or experienced some form of human rights abuse. And this is sort of just to get a sense, these are the most common things that were described. So rape, forced labor, indiscriminate violence, meaning violence perpetrated solely for no apparent reason, indiscriminate killing, forcing family members to watch someone get killed. Child militarization takes place mostly in the form of abduction. Crop grabbing was another one, which is when people come in and just take all the crops. That a lot of them are subsistence farmers. And then destruction of community resources, whether like water sources like wells, or even things like schools and clinics. And this was sort of another unique one that we had encountered, which is something called albino abduction. We encountered a lot of families that were fleeing because their children were being targeted. And this is mostly because it was thought that albinos have some magical properties, and so their bones were being used to make certain types of magic, I guess. Okay, so Friends of Kastor is basically a community-based organization that was founded by volunteers from the town. These are mostly Ugandans, in partnership with the district hospital. We have a few funding sources, but a lot of it is mostly private donations. We had a Spark grant from the International Association of Social Work for Groups, and also the United Nations Women's Guild. And one of the things we developed over the last couple of years is a psychosocial support group manual based on the clinical work that our social workers were doing. And it's basically a 3-session support group, usually done differently we separate women and men, And we run these, it's a model that's based on psychological first aid. And this has been very well received by a lot of the refugees, but we don't still have a lot of data on its efficacy, partly because this is a group that's incredibly mobile. They're only there for maybe 2 weeks, and then they move on to any number of different resettlement camps. So it makes it very difficult to follow them for any longer than 2 weeks. I just want to just emphasize that when we think of refugees, we think of mostly the trauma that they experienced initially, so whether it was because of war or because they were being persecuted. But really, it's good to think of the refugees' journey as being multiphasic in terms of the types of trauma that they experience. So this happens, and typically there's 5 stages to it. But after the initial persecution, there's the actual displacement where they have to flee, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean the majority of people who flee conflict actually don't leave their country, so they're internally displaced. And then there's also the trauma involved in having to leave your country completely with very little resources, and so that's the crossing. And at that point, you're technically a refugee. There's also a lot of trauma involved with having to sort of navigate being either a refugee or an asylum seeker or undocumented. That's in a host country, so whether that's in Uganda or whether that's in the United States. And then lastly, there's the resettlement process. If you are in a refugee camp, you may eventually have the opportunity to resettle to a third country. And we see that a lot, for example, in the United States. And that in and of itself also can be difficult. And what we focus mostly on at the transit camp in Uganda is the trauma that they've suffered before, but we address that at this 4th stage. And then a little bit of the work that we do with refugees here in the United States is mostly at this phase of their sort of journey. So it's good to just understand that it's not just one trauma or persecution, but there's different levels, and all of them can potentially have psychological sequelae. All right. Worldwide, this is last year's estimate, but there are about 71 million people who have been displaced for either conflict or environmental reasons. The vast majority of those people actually are not refugees. So about 41 million of them are internally displaced people. Either they are displaced and they move to some other place that is safer, but then are able to continue living there, or more often than not, maybe they do not make it out of the country because they don't have the means to, whether it's economical means or even physical means. About 26 million people worldwide do make it across the border, and these are people that we call refugees. And there's a smaller section of people who are called asylum seekers. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because it pertains to the work that we do here. So on average, about 37,000 people are forced to leave their homes every day. It's a lot of people. So who is a refugee? A refugee is a person who has been forced to flee their country, either due to persecution, war, or some form of violence. They have a well-founded fear of persecution, whether it's because of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And these are definitions that we have agreed upon as an international community on what a refugee is. And more importantly, they are not able to return home because they will either get killed or they will be thrown into prison. Asylum seekers are essentially the same. They meet the exact same criteria as refugees. But the only difference is before they receive that recognition, they have already fled into another country. And these are the 3.5 million people worldwide. Now, what kind of protections do refugees have? Well, we have, as an international community, agreed to certain standards that every person has a right to. Even as Americans, for example, we have a right as if we seek asylum in another country. So the first one is the principle of a non-refoulement, which is that you cannot be returned to your country of where you came from if you have credible reasons to not want to return, especially if it means there's a fear of persecution or a fear of harm. And we also have agreed worldwide that people have access to services. There's a legal status that people are given. And that either includes employment, education, health services, social security. And this is very important, entering, quote unquote, illegally does not count against you, according to international law. And I think this is important to know because I feel like this gets thrown out the window quite a bit when we talk about people who are trying to enter the country because they're being persecuted or because they're fleeing something. In the last 4 years, this has become an increasingly hot issue. We often confuse immigrants and refugees and illegal immigrants, but really we also forget that most people have a right to enter the country and to claim some form of asylum and protection. So I'm going to switch it up a little, but which country in the world has the highest number of refugees? And they're supposed to be A, B, C, D. But this way you can't get it wrong. So, correct, it's A. It's not the United States, actually, surprisingly. Most of the refugees in the world, first of all, by continent, are actually hosted in Africa. And the top refugee hosting countries are Turkey, 3.7 million people, followed closely by Pakistan and Uganda. So Uganda, like I told you earlier, we have 2 different countries with a lot of movement, particularly from the DRC and from the north, from Sudan. And now more and more people are actually also fleeing Burundi. But I think as Americans, we often sort of were brought up with the idea that we are a country that opens our arms to refugees, right? And there is some truth to that. It's just that we actually have the highest number of resettlements that happen here, which is a little bit different from refugees. So most people who resettle are refugees, it is correct. But the process is slightly different. So I'm going to just highlight that briefly here. So in the United States alone, we have had over 3 million refugees resettle over the last 5 decades. And by far, that is the highest in all of the countries. Okay, what are some of the things that happened in terms of our legal framework that allowed this to happen? So in the 1980s, we had a big, we reformed our very outdated Immigration and Nationality Act. And the Refugee Act of 1980 kind of opened the way for resettlement to happen. And it basically provided a structure of how to do that and also laid the groundwork for a lot of the services that we provide through the Department of Health and Human Services. And it had raised the limit of how many people we could resettle, as well as got rid of all the discriminatory laws that were in place before that, that sort of allowed certain groups of people to come in and resettle versus none. So this was a big act, actually, back in the 80s. And more importantly, it established an office that you may have heard of. It's called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, as well as the Office of Refugee Affairs. And this is nested within the Department of Health and Human Services. And they're responsible for almost all resettlement programs within the United States. So how does resettlement happen? So resettlement is basically, it's a lengthy process, but I'm going to start with an individual from Kastor. So let's say a family has fled conflict from some village in eastern Kivu, and they are no longer able to go back because they belong to a certain ethnic group, and if they go back, the Mai Mai rebels will hunt them down and they will shoot them. So they claim asylum first they cross the border into a transit camp, and then they move on to a more permanent resettlement camp. And there they will stay for a while. On average, they stay for many years. And if they are lucky, they may be identified as a family or an individual, perhaps, especially if there are children, who may benefit from resettlement, because it seems like there's no way they can go back. So they are then picked out and interviewed, and they are vetted basically through the State Department as well as the Department of Homeland Security. And if they go through all the checks, all the background checks, then they will be chosen then to go and resettle, let's say, in the United States. Once they do that, that's where they come to the United States and they're handed over to the Office of Refugee Affairs and the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which partners with, there are 9 huge organizations in the United States, like Catholic Relief Services, International, the IRC is another one, and they then plug them into communities that have been preparing to help and accept these resettled refugees. There was a documentary not too long ago called The Lost Boys. I don't know if you've heard of it. If you haven't, I would highly recommend you watch it. But it follows, I think, 3 boys from Sudan who were abducted at a very young age and had been forced to join one of the military groups, and then eventually they escaped, and they were orphans then, and they were then went through that whole process, and they, I think, ended up somewhere very, very cold in the Midwest. And it kind of documents their whole transition through that, which when you see it, you see that it's a very difficult experience. So what does the Office of the Refugee Resettlement provide? They provide a few very key things. One, they provide some medical assistance, and they provide some economic means to adjust and to sort of settle into a community. They provide language training if they don't speak English, vocational training. They do have services like counseling services for people who've been trafficked versus people who've been tortured. Then they have also some other targeted programs that I won't go into. But unfortunately, as of 2018, a lot of these services have been scaled back for our resettled refugees. If you look in the United States, since 1980, these are the rates of people being able to resettle in the United States. Back in the 80s, when we passed the Refugee Act, we had over 200,000, actually. But that has been slowly kind of decreasing, and the last couple years have seen a significant drop. As a matter of fact, last year there was a further reduction in the number of refugees who are allowed to resettle in the United States. So where do most of our resettled refugees come from in the United States? Actually, a big number of them still from one of the African countries. In New York State alone, so New York is actually the number 2 state in terms of hosting or resettled refugees. But in 2018, we had 1,280 refugees resettled. Actually, a very small percentage only come to New York City. A lot of them go to some of the other parts of New York, particularly places like Rochester. And as you can see, still 1/3 of refugees who are being resettled were coming from the DRC. So everything that I talked to you about in terms of resettlement is this path at the very top here. It's a lengthy process. It takes years, and sometimes families are not able to resettle together. So maybe one person will come over, and then following year, maybe the children will come over. But there are other ways that refugees can seek safety in the United States. And this is what we call the asylum process. And basically what it is, if you look at this schematic, it's when people, let's say, who are fleeing persecution, for example, they enter the United States with a valid visa, and then while they're in the United States, they go to immigration court and they say, I would like to claim asylum. This is actually a very common practice. The other versions that you see here are similar. This one here is the same. The person flees persecution, arrives at the border, and at the border they request, I would like, some asylum. And this is much more of a familiar process. I think I'm going to show you some imagery that will evoke some of the events that have happened. But as you know, like this is a picture of the migrant caravan that started out in Guatemala. It picked up a lot of news because the White House at the time was using it almost for political purposes. This, in fact, is that process here, which is, again, it's a totally legally sound way of seeking asylum. And the last way of seeking asylum is something called defensive asylum process. And that's when you flee persecution, you enter with a visa, let's say a tourist visa, but your visa expires. And then at that process, you try to seek asylum. And all three forms of asylum seeking are perfectly legal. We have, the only difference is when you go through the defensive asylum process, your chances of being granted a stay are quite a bit diminished. So just remember, asylum seekers, so people who are not being resettled, have just as much protection under the Refugee Act in the United States. The only difference is there's a lot of barriers for them to eventually be granted a stay. One that's new is that they have a 1-year limit to which they need to then apply for asylum. That doesn't often happen for a lot of our defensive asylum seekers. Some of them have been here for years. And then at that point, let's say they get caught because of ICE, and then they say, well, the truth is I can't go back because of X and Y reasons for persecution. This is just some of what I mentioned. The other thing that needs to be mentioned is the immigration detention. And this has become a bigger issue now because this is being overwhelmingly overused. So we've had detention of people who are asylum seekers for a while, but usually that's, people weren't permanently being detained. Most people, if they come and they're trying to seek asylum, they may be detained and they maybe go through that process where they're trying to claim that they would like to seek asylum, but oftentimes they may be detained for a short period of time and then released back to their families who, let's say, live in the United States, and they have an immigration date set, and they will then appear before the judge on that set immigration date. But more and more we have, as a deterrent perhaps, people are being detained indefinitely. And remember, these are not people who have committed any crime other than seeking asylum. These are some of those pictures from detention centers. And a lot of the news focuses on the detention centers and on the southern border. But the truth is, we actually live very close to one too. This is our closest detention center. And here we have also asylum seekers who are being detained. So, I'm going a little bit slow, so I'm going to speed it up a bit. But I wanted to talk about all of this is really because there is something that we as physicians here at Downstate can do to help in this entire sort of process for asylum seekers and refugees. In the sort of in the asylum seeking process, there are two types of expert witnesses that can help bolster the case for an asylum seeker to prove to the immigration judge that they have been victims of persecution. One of the expert witnesses is the medical expert, and that is whether you have a medical doctor or a clinician or therapist, someone who can testify to any sort of evidence, both in physical examination or in a psychological evaluation, that shows that they have lasting scars from whatever event, trauma that they've suffered. The importance of that medical affidavit, that is usually done by a clinician, is that the grant rate, in other words, the rate at which they are then allowed to stay and then seek citizenship 5 years later, is drastically higher for those who have received a medical affidavit. So 90% versus 37.5% of those who don't have it. So what is a medical affidavit? It's basically an evaluation to obtain facts pertinent to the history of torture that an asylum seeker may have suffered. Any sort of objective evidence of the persecution they may have suffered. So in terms of a physical evaluation, if someone has been, let's say, assaulted and they have scars, or they've been burned, or they have cigarette burns, or they were hung for hours and therefore have like scars on their arms, those are very easy to do because you take the narrative of the trauma, you look at the scars objectively, and you comment as to whether it's consistent with the trauma that they are describing. Whether the scar is old and whether it has healed poorly because they didn't get medical attention, et cetera, et cetera. The same goes for psychological evaluations. A great number of people, as you would imagine, who have suffered acute and severe trauma, severe trauma, months to years down the line will often develop some form of psychological sequelae, whether it's, and the most common obviously is PTSD, but it can be any sort of combination of anxiety disorder, it can be major depression, and so the psychological evaluation that can attest to those symptoms and the diagnosis can also be an objective evidence of the torture that they may have endured. And last year, or 2 years ago actually, we opened up our first asylum clinic here in partnership with the Brooklyn Free Clinic, which is the student-run clinic. And the student-run clinic here has done an incredible job of thinking of what it is they can do to make this as easy as possible for clinicians to do these medical affidavits. And what they have decided to do, modeled after what the students at some of the other medical schools do, is they basically go through the same trainings that we would as clinicians, and they go into the medical interview with you, and they document every aspect of it, and they serve as scribes. Because the second part of the medical evaluation is after you evaluate the client, then you have to write a legal document called the medical affidavit. And that part is, to be honest, is a little bit more time consuming because it follows a very specific format. But the point of having the student work as a scribe is the student will do that for you. And then once the student writes the medical affidavit, which can be pretty lengthy, then the clinician will then read and edit as needed before sending it off to the lawyer who will then also edit it. So we opened up our doors. People have been doing it at Downstate for a while, actually. Some other providers here have been doing medical affidavits, like Dr. Grant from neurology. But we opened up this sort of more formal space last year, and we've now had several people come through and get a medical affidavit. So this is just the basic logistics of what I already explained. But as you can see, there are many, many steps, a lot of which is basically taking the work off of clinicians. And we have coordinators who communicate with the lawyers. We have obviously the student, et cetera, et cetera. And we have the space to do it at the Brooklyn Free Clinic on Wednesdays. This is an example of what a medical affidavit letter looks like. It follows a very specific template, and really it's just kind of editing an already existing template. So what do you need to know, or what do you need to do to be able to do a medical evaluation or a psychological evaluation? So basically, you need to have the very sort of empathic and trauma-informed skill to elicit a trauma history and to know the basics of the consequences of severe trauma. And obviously, you have to have relevant history-taking skills, everything that we as clinicians already do. These are just some of the examples from a physical exam point of view that you might look for. But for psychiatry, really, we want to focus on the most common things being common things like PTSD, being able to evaluate and speak to whether or not they fit the DSM-5 criteria. Sometimes we have patients who do have much more complicated symptomatology. Like the other day, we had an asylum seeker from Guatemala who had developed depression, but also had, as a consequence of the abuse that she had been suffering for many years, developed non-suicidal self-injury, mostly in the form of cutting. And so it was a little tricky to have to talk to that and sort of describe how that might be linked to her trauma narrative. But it can get quite nuanced and difficult, and this is where we really kind of were hoping that we can have psychiatrists and psychologists sort of use their expertise a little better than, for example, me, because I'm mostly just an internist. And so, we hope that we can get some of the faculty to be involved as well. So what are the common barriers to doing medical affidavits? People think they don't have enough time or they don't have the space. Like I said earlier, we have student coordinators, we have scribes, we have the clinic space to make that as easy as possible. Some people are a little bit intimidated because they don't have the time or perhaps even the experience. So again, there's a lot of layers of editing that happen. So it's not like once you write and finalize the legal affidavit that's the end and be all. A lot of times there's a lot of back and forth, particularly with the lawyers. And then lastly, people feel like they don't have the training necessary. So, these slides were done with the thought that maybe we would have the training afterwards. But I will assure you that probably we will have another training very soon, maybe not at Downstate, but definitely within New York. It basically cycles between Cornell, Columbia, and I guess now Downstate. And so throughout the year, maybe every 3 or 4 months, one of the institutions will be hosting a training. It's a training that takes place in one day, usually. When we did it on Sunday, it was from 9 o'clock. We were done around 3 o'clock. And it's sort of a primer. You won't walk out of the training feeling 100% confident, but that's not the point. The training is to kind of get you thinking and know what resources you have available so that when you're ready to do it, here at the Brooklyn Clinic, hopefully, then we'll be able to set you off in the right direction with all the support that you need to do one of these. And finally, this is something that is always brought up, but residents can do these medical interviews. Usually they will do it alone or with a medical student. The only thing is we need to have an attending to precept the case. So the attending will not have to be in the room during the medical interview, but it's something that they should at least be aware of so that they can precept the case. And then usually during the physical evaluation, if there is one, the attending should be present because they need to be able to at least testify that they also saw the same scars, let's say. But yes, residents are totally encouraged to also do these medical affidavits. And that's pretty much it. So really the key take-home points is, asylum seekers and refugees have the same rights and protections under international as well as US law. We as clinicians can play quite a pivotal role in sort of the outcome that a lot of these asylum seekers have in the United States. And hopefully we'll be able to get you guys involved and we'll send out information for anyone who's interested in getting trained in how to do this. That's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a totally enlightening talk, and I have to imagine that there might be a line in front of your office for volunteers that might be interested.
I hope so.
In
we want to get as many people to do this because there's a huge need right now.
With that being said, we only have about 7 or 8 minutes, but we generally, this is our Q&A session, and we generally start off with trainees and students, if there are any questions.
Yes?
Thank you, Dr. Murakami. I want to ask about the clients that you see. What kind of resiliencies do they have? Are they relying on their religion or their cultural practices? What makes them different from patients maybe in this country who are suffering from PTSD?
I think that's a great question. Unfortunately, for most refugees, meaning people who've actually fled whatever persecution or conflict they in their village or in their home country, who make it to the border, across the border, into another country, there is almost like a selection factor that happens. If you look at refugees, and this is the argument against people saying that people who are refugees or coming into the country legally are the sickest or they have mental illnesses. They actually, to have survived all those stages, it really very quickly filters out those who have severe psychiatric comorbid conditions as well as severe medical comorbid conditions. At the camp that I work in the DRC, in Uganda, the majority of people are really young. Most of them are women, and there are hardly any people who are elderly. And that just goes to show that for every one person who makes it to the border, to the refugee camp, there are probably 9 to 10 people who either won't make it because they'll try and they will fail fleeing. And so in terms of psychiatric sort of resiliency, I find that for most, compared to the average population, they tend to have a lot more resiliency. Now, I'm going to have to also preface that with the fact that they have been traumatized for the most part. They are oftentimes separated from family and their communities that they grew up in. They've been persecuted for political, religious, whatever reasons. And so even though they may have an innate, perhaps, resiliency, they are also stripped of everything that is often needed for your wellness. So it's a little bit of a positive and a negative. And I think what then eventually helps people to strive and to continue is really dependent on so many factors. And part of why resettlement, for example, is really such a community-based effort, and why so many of the religious institutions have played such a key role in it, is because in addition to providing sort of the services that the Office of Resettlement and Refugee and Resettlement does, it really requires a larger communal understanding. And a lot of these communities, let's say in rural New York, or most of these other towns that work with refugees, they have been often trained extensively through these organizations. And they actually do very well in terms of welcoming and making sure they have families that kind of pair up with the families to make sure that they're doing okay. The kids are taken into schools with knowing other children already. So there's a lot of things that are sort of environmental and ecologically that are there to try to improve their success of, let's say, resettling. But there's still a lot of need, I guess. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a complicated question. I think there's so many different ways to answer it. But
any other questions from trainees? Let's open it up to the audience.
Thank you again, and thank you for your comments about the psychiatry residency. It means a lot to all of us to be recognized. A very quick question, and then maybe a little bit longer one. What languages do you speak in the hospital in Uganda? And number two, are there times, and if there are, how do you get through the resistance that some of these people may have to speaking to anybody? Because they're so wounded, and they may think that you're ICE, and they may not believe your ID or whatever. And I've heard that could be a substantial challenge in certain parts of the country, and hopefully maybe not here. Just curious.
Well, so I think there's two separate things. So in the hospital in Uganda, you mean? Yeah. So there, the language that's spoken in Kastor is actually Rufumbira, which is very similar to Kinyarwanda, which is spoken in the eastern part of the DRC as well as throughout Rwanda. It's weird, like a lot of these borders didn't quite capture the, for example, cultural divisions that might maybe be in place. So it turns out one of the good things about seeing patients in that hospital is language is usually not a barrier, because the Ugandans who work there and speak Rufumbira, which is essentially the same as Kinyarwanda, which is what is spoken in the eastern DRC. But going towards the other issue is when someone...
They interpret in English.
Yeah, so a lot of times, if it's something that is very nuanced and very difficult, we actually have a psychiatric nurse, a Ugandan psychiatric nurse that also sees the patients in that hospital. But I do have to say, for those, for the refugees who are brought in for medical reasons, who have been psychologically scarred, communication is incredibly difficult. We've had people come in sometimes with almost severe catatonia, or people who came in because they thought, oh, this patient must have like a CNS infection because they are writhing on the ground and they look like they're seizing. And then you do the workup and there's no infection, there's nothing going on, but the patient is still, not responding. And this is really, it speaks to the severity of the trauma that they go through. Here in the United States, when we see people at the asylum clinic, a lot of our clients are actually from Central or South America. And a lot of them have been here for a while, and they either speak a little English, but usually we have an interpreter that's organized by the lawyer's office that comes. It's a certified interpreter, and they'll be there to speak in Spanish and English, or any other language, to be honest.
And are they frightened of people coming in? Do they understand the process?
Oh yeah, no. The lawyers usually, they know that this is part of the legal process, and that the medical affidavit will be used to help them in their case, and so usually they're understanding of the situation. Now we do make a very good delineation between this not being any sort of therapeutic relationship. Like we're not there to then make treatment or referrals, although we do refer them then if they need to the Brooklyn Free Clinic if they need any kind of medical attention. But that's not done through the same. It's supposed to be a separate provider altogether.
Okay, we're unfortunately out of time. Dr. Murakami, you'll be able to stay a little while longer for additional questions. I was just wondering, where can people who want to volunteer, any of the physicians or residents that want to volunteer, where do they contact?
So they can contact me, or they can contact, Sam. I'm just going to put him out there because he's our champion. But the other person, you can also just email the Brooklyn Free Clinic and say we'd like to find out more information and how we'd like to get involved, because we really, really need people. So, thank you.